So thank you everyone for showing up today. Today we're going to go through the abstract of the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, a new kind of reality theory, 2002 paper. We're going to unpack all of the parlance and content in that paragraph, and then we're going to have a discussion about what that is trying to tell us. I'm going to share that. So the so we discussed the first part of this last week is that science depends on observation and perception in order for it to make sense. And so we have to model reality not only as, something that can be scientifically observed, but something that actually has everything required for science. You have to have, replicable observations and this kind of unified perceptual reality. You have to have the ability for identification agents to hypothesize about the nature of reality and then apply that to their observations. And so what the CTMU really is about is it's a model of perception, and perception is what drives forward everything in the universe, is that it's the self-identification or self-perception of the universe. So not only is reality scientific content that can be empirically studied, but it's also a scientist. It is going through all of these hypotheses, which are called, you can think of telons as hypotheses. There's something that is driving forward adaptation and evolution in order such that you have a greater end. And then if that works, and there's not something that's predetermined, but reality is adapting on the fly to freely changing internal conditions. And so what that means is that reality is actually trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, what is true, what is not, and exclude those things which are bad from its identity, and then refine its identity through those things which are consistent with itself. And so reality is multiplexing itself. It is making itself greater through the process of its evolution, and everything that is consistent with its structure is then embedded within reality itself. So inasmuch as science is observational or perceptual in nature, if we want to ground science, and that means not only our ability to make valid predictions, which is the goal currently of science, but also to explain how valid predictions can come about. Why do we have any conceptual correspondence between our theories, our models, and the formal universes that we study? We have to actually bring those three things into coincidence. So a unified scientific model says that theories, models, and their universe are one and the same. Reality has a theory about itself, which is its internal self-identity, and then its self-identification is the process by which it extends its self-model through the evolution of the universe. And that's how complex systems come about. It's not something that's random or totally determined, but it's somewhere in between. It's self-determining because there is this primordial freedom, this drive to creative evolution that drives the evolution of complex systems. And to understand how that works, you need to think about the connection between theories and universes, or observers and observations. And so that's why you need a supporting theory of reality, of which perception itself is the model. And what that means is that, the CTMU defines all of reality as the perception itself, just the raw fact of experience. And then this is the same way Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the great logicians, defines reality also, is these three universes. There is perception, there's the relational stratification, and then there's this unification called Peircean thirds, which is how those perceptual models connect to reality. And so the CTMU is Peircean firsts, seconds, and thirds. It means that everything is either perception or it's the infrastructure of perception, because everything is reaching towards the self-identification of the whole. So that means that the mechanisms by which systems become more complex is that multiplexing of the internal self model to then drive forward creative evolution. So any questions on the first sentence thus far, or comments or observations?
Yes, you said perception, stratification, and the model.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, and
I will have to read the Persian stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, and I can pull that up right now. It's called Charles Sanders Peirce, who's a logician who Christopher Langan has cited as one of the major influences on CTMU, especially with regard to mathematical logic. Is he had this idea of the three universes. And so basically what that means is that, we have one universe, which is, one second, I'm working on finding this, is Peircean firsts is here we go, I got it. Moment. So Peircean first is just action, is just perception. It's just there's nothing that's changed. It's just the raw fact of experience, and that's just one thing. We don't experience great like jumps or breaks in our perception. It's just, and so then that, but perception doesn't really make sense without anything to stratify it, without anything to interpret that perception. So then you have Peircean seconds, which is the reaction to that perception, and that's happening in a subconscious way, but it's relating the formal and the manifest. It's you're taking the rules and structure of your perception and applying that to the percept. And then the Peircean thirds is how that is then encoded in between internal and external reality. So that perception, which has now been interpreted, then assimilates itself into, it's actually encoded as information and then drives forth further perception. And so you need to think about not just perception in the sense of human sight, but in a little bit of a broader sense, is that perception is essentially the ability to interact iteratively in a way that is stable across iterations with the universe. And so everything is in the process of perception, and you can think about like natural selection. What that's selecting for is perception. It's the ability for species to interact with their environment. And then there's essentially this triadic feedback, which is Peircean thirdness, is everything has to be tested against the universe in order to see if it works. And so that is happening both at the biological level, but it's also happening at the universe's level, is that the universe has an internal self-representation, which is called its theory, and then it models that through the progression of the universe. And so I think that that's what Langan is trying to say in this line. It's not that there's, a faculty of like human sight to everything in the universe, because that doesn't make too much sense, but that there's a more general feature of perception that guides all complex systems.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned stratification before, and I'm sure I've heard a definition, but could you just define stratification?
Yeah. So what stratification means is that, it is that something has, an original. We'll get to what is a strata. A strata is essentially a level of something. So stratification just means like, what are the different levels that comes in? Is that it's not, you don't just have the raw fact of experience, but by the time you get to seconds, by the time you get to the representation or mediation, there's essentially like it's your perceptions are formed and arranged by your cognitive perceptual syntax that then allows for everything to kind of make sense and have some sort of coherence.
So does stratification, does that, oh, that almost sound, you said strata, that almost sounds like a hierarchy
Yeah,
between
exactly.
between primary and secondary.
Yeah, so basically what stratification means is that, you're taking just the raw fact. It's monadic. Nothing has been interpreted yet. And then through reference
Yeah.
to an interpretant, you're arranging and classifying all of your perceptions. And your perceptions aren't just, it's not like there's like every little pixel is rendered, but actually this is something that was discovered by Carl Friston with the free energy principle, is that your perceptions are stratified according to their utility for you. So that's why something can catch your eye. It's because you've identified something of value to yourself. And so that's basically what perception is you can only see like a very tiny amount of the things that are in your eyesight. There's only one thing that you're focusing on at a time. And so the focus broadly is that stratified perception. And so this is what some guys like Jordan Peterson have talked about, is that like what you're perceiving is, ideally the highest possible thing, because that means that all of your striving is oriented towards one thing. But that actually has a technical definition in neuroscience, which is that your brain doesn't render things according to their objective content, but according to how they can be of value to you. So that's what it means that and that is explained by the CTMU with cognitive perceptual syntax combined with emotelic syntax, is that your brain is recognizing that there is a lack or a need that you have, and then everything is organized according to that. But that happens not at
What?
the monadic level, but at the dyadic level.
Sorry, I don't know what emotelic means. Do you mean emotional, as an emotional?
Yeah, that's a term which we'll cover. It comes up later in this paper. But basically, the idea with that is there are four. So syntax just means like the rules of things. And so there are four rules by which your brain operates. And what Chris Langan calls the human cognitive perceptual syntax, which is a big word, but it just means like how humans think and perceive. And so that's broken down into four levels. There is the logico-mathematical syntax, which is how we think about logical and kind of abstract things in the world, right? Things that aren't necessarily really there. There's space-time object syntax, which is just how we recognize things as physically extended in space-time. There's the emotelic syntax, which is basically another fancy word, but it just means emotions. Emo stands for emotional, and Telic stands for like telesis, but it means like teleology, which is the end or purpose. So your emotions are oriented towards some end or purpose. So a simple example of that would be like, I'm driving on a highway. If I'm really hungry for a burger, I'm not going to see like every like tiny little like road sign, but I will see, the Burger King over there, because I've recognized a lack within myself, and there is an end or purpose, that I want to have a burger that is driving me towards the fulfillment of that goal. So how that applies to perception is that that's what you're doing all of the time when you focus on the brunch buffet or a pretty girl. It's like that's because that is something that you've identified through that syntax as something that is potentially of value to you.
I just realized something. When we perceive something, when we focus in on something, we our brain automatically generates more complex versions of what we're perceiving in like our imagination. So would that be our version of the expansive? Because information is complexified through perception in the CTMU, and that's done via expansion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's like just focusing on something, your brain generates more and more possibilities, and that's complexification.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't mean to suggest that like we can only do simple things, but maybe you see a burger place and are like, it would really be great if I could go there often. I should,
Yeah.
go apply for a job. Or like, I see a pretty girl, maybe I should go to the gym and work out more. And then,
Yeah,
at
exactly.
some
You
point.
generate possibilities, don't you?
Exactly. So it's not just that this is the point of the stratifications, that it's not just that you're perceiving things, but then you're making meaning out of the things that you perceive. But subconsciously, the things which catch your eye are things which are like, you're kind of being helped out a little bit by your brain, because it's something that is helping you towards the goals that you've set for yourself. and those can be positive or those can be negative, but what's happening with your thinking and perception.
Right. Would you say that stratification and complexification are basically two sides of the same coin, or are they different things?
Yeah, I mean, well, in some way, they're two sides of the same coin, because something stratified is actually something becoming more simple. It's that you're ordering and arranging things to kind of make meaning out of just these seemingly random things. Like I'm looking at, tons of perceptual data, but what I register that is as discrete objects, because my brain can't handle every little molecule of everything in my room. It's just the things which are of value to me and that exist as a discrete whole. So stratification is the, if you think about, we can coin a new term. This is stratification, complexification, duality. It's like
Yeah,
one.
I was going to say that's duality.
Exactly. So that's a duality, because one of
It's another oxymoron.
yeah, and that's what's called in the CTMU. It's called constructive filtrative duality. Is that you're filtering your perceptions, which you can think of as stratification, and then you're then constructing new things. You then take in more data, which is then interpreted by your brain and your cognitive perceptual syntax, and that helps you exist and live and make choices in the world. And so those are two sides of the same coin, because one, you're basically getting help.
You're
You're
getting
basically
helped by the primary teller.
yeah, exactly. So you're a secondary image of the primary teller, which means you have independent wants and drives and goals, and that is reflected in the things that you see. And then, I'm not forced to do anything, but then, when I take into account everything that I'm seeing and thoughts that are instantiated, that should ideally, if I'm oriented positively, help me to exist in the world better and make more complex things. And that's our job as identification agents, is to basically make meaning out of the things in our lives and what we see and think about.
Did I miss something? You said 4 syntaxes and I only got 3. I got logical mathematics, space-time object, and emotelic syntax. Did I miss something?
Yeah, well, I didn't get to the fourth one, because
Oh,
we were discussing emotelic syntax, but the fourth one is yeah, Patrick says in the chat it's qualio-perceptual syntax, QPS, which basically a qualia is like a unit of perception. It's like, that's basically a Peircean first. It's just pure perception. And then perception is those two next steps, which is how we register the qualia that we see. So qualia basically just means, like, that is a thing, that is a discrete object of subjective experience. And then our perception is how we, just as we described, is how we actually perceive things.
got you. Thank you.
Yeah, it looked like we had some things. So then we can kind of think about, how does that relate to reality theory. So going back to the paper, it's like, that's what we're doing at the human scale, but the idea is that perception itself is the model of nature. So how can that be? What is, like, reality doing such that it is experiencing and participating in something akin to our human-like perception, where we're taking in input and then ordering it and then putting it back output in a way that was not, it's not like a Turing machine, which, if you don't know, it's like it takes in a string, it's not like a computer that like takes in a string of ones and zeros and then spits out a different string of ones and zeros, and that's totally determined by the software and the programming. But we actually participated in that thing. We took in something, it was ordered and related in our minds, and then we are then able to use that as input towards our greater thing. So what is the universe doing that is sort of like that?
It's a proto-computer.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like the syntax and the information both, they happen over and over, so it's almost like the syntax is part of the string of information, although it's the thing that's processing the string of information.
Yeah.
Would you also say I'm trying to relate my understanding of quantum computing to the proto-computer, and whereas the normal computer is binary, I feel like humans are much more. There is a one, a two, and perhaps, or a third bit. I don't know how to put that, but a third bit that is both, or that is neither. Would you go ahead? Would you agree with that, or
Yeah,
what?
yeah, I would. So basically this is something that I've talked about. It's that, and this comes from Roger Penrose. What he basically wrote is that computers can never simulate human thinking because computer thinking is reducible to computation. It's reducible to just ones and zeros, whereas there's something elusive, there's something a little more interesting about the way that human cognition works that, isn't taken into account by just information processing. So basically something much more interesting is happening, and that's what's described by those four syntaxes, is that those are ways in which we perceive the identity of reality into ourselves, is that we are function as identification operators and agents in the world. And then we are then able to, we, just like the universe we said had a self model, we have a self model. We're constrained, but we're not determined by anything external to us. So we have something which is not computationally reducible, which is free will. It's like if you take every input, a lot of people will say, if we just knew like every little thing that was happening in the world and we had all the information, then we could predict the next state. But that's not true, because the world is not just responding to the global dynamics, but it's also responding to local dynamics. It's responding to us as secondary tellers who are then working towards the fulfillment of reality. And basically what reality is saying is like, there's a deeper level of omniscience. It's like it's a deeper level of omniscience to know what it's like not to know everything. And so then if we don't know everything, we are not knowledgeable about the entire state of reality, then reality is at the global level is sort of deterministic, because it has everything taken into account, and the way that it actually identifies itself and isn't just like, this is the reason why reality can't just be abstract. I talked about this in my interview with Arval, is that you have to actually be embodied in like a actual thing with choices that exists in physical reality in order to have free will. It's like you couldn't just make like a model of like, on like a computer of like, this is what Tommy will do at this moment, this is what, you'll do the next. But you have to replace ordinary computation with exactly what Patrick said, which is proto-computation, where
Can I just add something for Lavelle? I think that I found that a good way to think about the global and local teller is the constructive and the filtrative duality, is actually a good way to think about it, is that in the filtrative domain, you have a thing which is asking questions. And then in the constructive domain, you have answers, and those answers can be yes and no. But until they've actually answered yes or no, they're kind of existing in a state of potential, which is analogous to the inner expansive domain. And the yes or no answer is analogous to the requantization. I mean, what do you think about? Am I just talking out my?
Somebody? Did I lose somebody?
Does that make any sense at all? I'm not sure. Yeah, Patrick thinks it's interesting.
I don't know if we lost, but we might have lost Tommy.
No,
Tommy,
I'm still here.
Okay, okay, good. That makes
Well,
sense to me, by the way.
yeah, well, what do you think about that, Tommy? A little way of putting it.
yeah, I think that that's exactly true, and that kind of encapsulates what I was trying to say in better, more simple language, is that ordinary computation is just like we have both the question and the answer, and they're already going to happen. We're just passing it through a language. Whereas proto-computation involves SCSPL. It involves the self-configuring, self-processing language. And what that means is that, we are able to configure ourselves and take in that information. So processing is basically taking in the question, and configuring is answering the question. Is we actually have the free choice to do that, and that means that we're not determined by anything outside of us. It's like you said, we can say yes, no, you can say maybe, it doesn't matter. We can say whatever we like because we have that free choice. The answer to the question, because like think about this from a very simple perspective, is like if you already had the question answered, then what's the point of asking the question? So that's what we mean. We use all these big words, but like that's what we mean when we say that the purpose of reality is self-identification. That wouldn't be possible, right? If all the questions reality had were already answered. But reality is basically seeing what it's like to share its authority and its power and knowledge, with things which are in essence separate from its choice. And then it takes in that information, and that is what drives forward the world.
Very cool.
Yep. So we can is the paper still shared like on the screen?
Yeah, still there.
All right. So the next line actually interestingly gets into basically exactly what we're talking about, which is where information is the abstract currency of perception. So basically, perception is the process of figuring out what the question is that we're being asked. Such a theory must incorporate the theory of information. So basically, this is just setting up conceptually what the CTMU is going to be about. Like this is an abstract for a paper. So it's like, we're going to have to take in what we know about information, but you have to extend the information concept because information deals with ordinary languages, whereas CTMU information theory deals with a self-configuring, self-processing language that stratifies itself. So this is something which is talked about in the metaformal system paper, is that SCSPL actually breaks down into, this ordered hierarchy, is that there is an SCSPL for us humans, and we are part of the grammar, the rules, the structure of reality as a whole. So we actually are pretty important to reality's self-identification. So it must take into account the theory of information, obviously, because that's essentially what we're talking about. But you have to extend the information concept to incorporate reflexive self-processing. So we're not being processed by something outside of us. There's no puppet master that is controlling, fate and destiny, but actually it is self-processing. We are part of that global intention that then decides what will happen in the future. And so that's something that is not taken into account in ordinary information theory or even ordinary informational physics. This is kind of in vogue nowadays to say like the universe is an informational system, but you have to take into account that self-processing is that it like you said, it's that we are getting asked questions and then we answer questions, and that is not and the answer to that is not determined. We are providing new information with our answers, and those answers, which are actually axioms, there are the rules by which reality is then derived in the future. And so that is how we, as locally cognitively bound people, can actually impact the global structure of the universe, is that have we have basically the ability to generate new axioms on the fly through our free choice for reality's derivation and evolution. And then, you can think of us, our life is basically, we are like programmers for the universe. We're adding lines of code every time we make a decision, and that is how the universe will then evolve in the future. So it incorporates that reflexive self-processing. And what reflexive means is that it's not something that's happening outside of ourselves, but it's something that's quite related to us. It's something that, we are basically involved in the universe, where the universe as a whole is a self-synthesized informational system, and then we are implicated in our information through that free choice. So it says then this extension is associated with a limiting formulation of model theory. So model theory deals with what is the formal connection between our theories and our universes, and that's what's called a model, is something that connects our abstract ideas to like the real world. But the CTMU says that these are actually all the same. So a limiting formulation of model theory, this is actually a really interesting sentence for a lot of reasons. It's because all the great advances that we've made in science over the last however many centuries, or at least most of them, have not totally disproved the previous theory, but instead taken the previous theory as a limiting model of the former. So like, for example, relativistic physics, as pioneered by Albert Einstein, what he basically saw is that if you model reality as four-dimensional with time as that dimension, then space and position and time are all related to one another. And as you up the space coordinates, either if you're traveling really fast or if you are, then you experience something that's like time dilation, is that time actually slows down as you approach very close to the speed of light. But and you can look at the Lorentz transformations, but if you plug the numbers in, that has a very marginal effect. If you're below some small if you're at some small percentage of the speed of light, which is obviously still incredibly fast, that still will only get you off by like a couple thousandths of a percent, depending on what it is. But so basically, classical physics is a limiting formulation of relativity, is that at low velocities, relativity and and Newtonian physics have the same predictions. They say force will always be equal to mass times acceleration, and we'll have a predictable velocity, acceleration, and so forth. So the CTMU is a limiting extension of model theory. It says, yes, models and theories and universes are connected, and that's a limit, as we were talking very abstractly. But for the universe itself, beyond just our scientific theories, the theory and the universe are the same, and so there is an operator that connects mental and physical reality for every object. So everything has to have an operator in order for it to connect its abstract existence in what's called the non-terminal domain, which means literally without end. And that goes back to what we were talking about last week or 2 weeks ago with the Ein Sof. And so that is this world of abstract informational potential that can basically collapse in on itself, that in order such that it has a physical embodiment. And so there's an operator that connects the physical instantiation in the terminal domain, which is a world with an end. It's something that actually has like physical extension in the world. And then that connects between the abstract domain, and the non-terminal domain is what's called a programming domain. And so that's where all of this programming is happening. When we're talking about we as humans are programmers, that's happening in the non-terminal domain. And so if the CTMU is, as we've said in the last 2 sessions, is isomorphic to reality's description of itself, and isomorphic means a structure preserving mapping, meaning that nothing is lost informationally when we say that the CTMU is the same as reality, because one is identified with one another. So they're literally defined based on each other. And so then if reality is self-generating and self-modeling as it has to be, then our theory of reality is identical to the universe on the syntactic level. It doesn't mean you can just look through all these words and you're like, oh, that's the universe. No, far from it. But if you go behind that and look at the logical language that underlies it, it's all of these very simple rules that apply to everything in reality. So it's identical to its universe on the syntactic level. And syntactic just means rules and structure. So the rules and structure that identify the CTMU universe are the same that identify the actual universe. And that means that we actually finally have some sort of real ground on which to base how we talk about the world. So that's a very dense sentence. So I don't, if there are any questions about that, sorry about my voice also. All right, so we can continue, and we wouldn't necessarily have to get through this whole paragraph, but so by nature of its derivation, this theory, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, so that means we're connecting cognitive theory, model, and universe. Those three things are all the same, or CTMU, is super tautological. Super tautological means it's not just a tautology like a bird is like a blue jay is a bird, or even simpler, a blue jay is a blue jay. It's something that by its very definition is true, and that's true of the CTMU, but it's a super tautology because we're applying that to reality. So some examples of super tautologies that apply to all of reality. Existence exists, reality is real. And that's basically all that the CTMU is saying, is that reality consists of all and only reality. So then it can be regarded as a super tautological reality theoretic extension of logic, because logic denotes inclusion within reality. So because logic is the structure of truth, and true things exist in the world and untrue things don't. So it would be untrue if I said, I saw a unicorn last night, because that's not actually something, as far as I'm aware, that exists in the world, and certainly I didn't see one yesterday. But so that is falsehood. It would be illogical for me to say that, because logic is the structure of truth, and that's not something that actually existed in the real world. So then it's an extension of logic that then unites the theory of reality with an advanced form of computational language theory. So that's, we'll get into that, but that's basically the idea with Noam Chomsky of automata and transformational language, is that there's this deep structure, and then where basically the non-terminal domain is basically whipping this deep structure. It's whipping ultimate reality to get to these great and interesting designs and plans and things that exist in the world. But that is actually a transformation of the deep underlying syntax. The deep rules all contain potentially what actually exists in the world. So that's it. So there's an advanced form of computational language theory, which we'll talk about, and the CTMU is actually a theory of language, which describes reality, as we've said a number of times before, as a self-configuring, self-processing language, or SCSPL, a reflexive intrinsic language. So intrinsic meaning it's not something external to reality, but it is reality itself. It is reality's self-model. It is both the language, the theory, as well as the self-configuration and self-processing, and that which is configured and processed. So it is theory, model, and universe. It's a reflexive, meaning there's nothing outside of itself. Intrinsic language, characterized not only by self-reference and recursive self-definition, so it defines and refers to itself. There's nothing outside of itself to which it could refer. This is the reality principle, right? It's reality. Nothing outside of reality can influence reality in any way, shape, or form. And reality is defined in the CTMU as SCSPL. So SCSPL reality embodies a dual aspect monism consisting of infocognition. So that's both information, as we talked about with like asking questions. There's both information, there's both that which is asked, and then there's cognition. There's that which, takes that, internally models it, and then gives a response to that information, which then creates more information. And so that's happening both with us humans whenever we make a choice, and it's also happening in the world. So basically, reality is self-transducing information. Transducing meaning it takes in an input and then puts out a different output. And it does that. Everything exists within SCSPL. It exists within this intrinsic language. And it does this through syntactic operators like humans or particles or whatever else. So everything is happening internally to the self-processing of SCSPL, which is why reality is essentially informational. So I guess that I threw a lot out at you there. We're about halfway through. I don't if there are any questions about those several lines.
So would a a syntactic operator be then like a quanta, like a fundamental quanta, like a proton or a cell or a human? You could like quantize those as different strata of syntactic operators. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. A syntactic operator it's basically a different way of saying syntactor, and there are three strata. There are three levels of syntactors. There's the global syntactor, which is basically God or reality, and that decides everything. That's basically, well, it's not just SCSPL, but that basically is SCSPL. That is the ultimate global identity that contains everything within it. And then we are syntactors because we receive that rules and structures. And then also the smallest quanta of syntactic operation is what's usually called syntactic operators, but is technically tertiary syntactors. It's like do you know the idea by Leibniz of monads?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so those are basically monads. They don't have any physical extent, but they're basically like the nodes in reality's processing. They're like these windowless souls which reflect the global dynamics of primary and secondary syntactors. So they don't really have any intrinsic ability of their own, but they are acted upon by higher dynamics.
Okay. So they have no extension whatsoever. So they're exclusively then would it be non-terminal that they are?
Yeah, so those are non-terminal, and then terminally those can be made to embody not one-to-one, but terminally then the terminal representation of how reality processes itself is then obviously, the physical things that we're familiar with from physics, like, the quantum objects, electrons, protons, atoms, and so forth. It's like everything it is all of that. Patrick says tertiary syntactors must have extension. Why am I wrong about that? So they do have extension, but not in the non-terminal domain, because that's a non-extensional domain, but in the terminal domain. So basically, tertiary syntactors do have extension, but they are at their essence are not something that exists physically. They're something that exists mentally, and then there's an operator that connects its non-terminal identity with its terminal identity, which is a different way of saying that connects its spiritual identity with its material instantiation.
Okay, I might be misunderstanding what tertiary syntactors are, because when I think of a syntactor, I think of one of those spheres that's expanding or conspanding in a manifold. Or you could also frame it as an event potential, right? So, but it has to have physical extent because the entire world is made up of those, right? So can you go over again maybe why I'm wrong about that? Because maybe I didn't understand your response.
Yeah, so that is consistent with what I'm saying. So
Okay.
what Langan said about this in his book FAQs about reality, which is a collection of his Patreon posts, is essentially that you can describe reality in three different ways, and I'll see if I can remember what he said. It's either you can think of it as kind of a swarm of interpenetrating spheres, which I guess is how you've said. Wait, give me one moment to I don't think I have it, but there are actually this is worthwhile. So I'm going to, if bear with me a minute, and I'll try to pull this up.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I should.
Can I just quickly ask, would you say that extension and retraction is another oxymoron?
I'd say it's another one of those dualities that we talked
Yeah.
about. It's another way of thinking about constructive filtrative duality.
See, what I would really like in the CTMU would be a list of all the oxymorons and all the self-relations that exist in parallel to one another. I think that would really help to clarify it.
Yeah.
There are a lot.
Yeah, there are so many, and they're kind of just a little bit, I don't know, they're not very, I don't know, there's something informal about the way he uses them. I feel like it could be so much more formal.
Yeah. Well, there is a little bit of a problem with that, which is like you can keep coming up with new ones. Like we've basically said two more today.
So far I've written down answer question, display program, and extension retraction.
Yeah, so then
And
that's
but those seem to be perfectly valid oxymorons to describe reality.
yeah.
In what sense are you using the word retraction?
Well, retraction is like it's like the oxymoronic opposite of extension, isn't it? And Langen himself has said that when we die, we get retracted back to the global teller. I mean, I don't know exactly what retraction means. I couldn't exactly define it. I've just heard it used a bunch of words and I sort of understand it, but I don't really, to be honest.
Yeah, can I see this is I think this should hopefully explain the question, and then if not, you can of course ask it again. So but to what Patrick was saying about is that you can think of reality in one of three ways. It's that, or we'll just read this paragraph. It says don't, and because this connects with what we're talking about with SCSPL. So it says, don't see how language and reality could have anything in common, even though you and everyone else uses language to describe various parts of reality every single day. So this is, well, that part's just basically almost making fun of the people who would deny such a thing because we're utilizing the correspondence between language and reality for every single thing that we ever do. But the meat of the paragraph is this, is that let's focus on the identification operators themselves and call reality a kind of operator algebra, an identity system consisting of identity operators that identify the states of other identity operators. That's what we're talking about with monads in the non-extensional sense, is that they just reflect the global and local identities of the things which order them, and they're sort of like windowless souls. They
Would you say that tertiary syntactors are synonymous with self-relations?
they are self-relating.
They are the dual aspect self-relations which sort of glue together primary and secondary tellers, and they reflect both of them.
Yes, exactly. So this, we talked about infocognition, is that they're both they are the basic units that comprise reality, and reality is essentially infocognitive. So they're not necessarily themselves thinking, but they are of the nature that can be interpreted and can create an infocognitive reality. So that means they can be taken in as perceptual input, which is not an obvious feature, right, of matter. Why is it that we can see material things? It's because there's a deeper level than matter, which is these syntactic operators. So in a kind of abstract sense, he says then that you can think of these operators as, like Patrick said, and he's done a number of, I believe, kind of animations or thoughts about this, is that you can think of these operators as a swarm of interpenetrating spheres. So everything engulfs everything else's rules, everything else's structure, and they are constantly reconfiguring, and it looks kind of chaotic from the inside, but they're ordered by these global dynamics, which assimilate and locate each other or internally simulate each other. So that's what I meant. This is this kind of weird phrase that Leibniz uses in his monadology, is windowless souls, which is weird. Like how can we describe, basically the closest thing to this would be like quantum foam in the universe, which is not exactly what we're talking about, but that's the closest thing in the language of physics. It's like, how can we describe that as like a soul? That like feels like so wrong almost. And what does it mean that it's windowless? It means that we can't peer into it, but every little thing has embedded within it the syntax of the entire reality self-simulation, meaning that reality's processing and configuration is embodied within every single tertiary syntactors that are constantly assimilating and locating one another in space and time. And so that's the physical extension. And so that might be, I think, what Patrick is talking about. And then, but those extend into the non-terminal domain, this world of design and potential in order to do so. So the self-simulation has two aspects. There's this non-terminal or programming domain, and then there's this terminal or display domain. And syntactic operators connect those two domains and therefore connect physical and metaphysical reality.
So they're like almost like the fundamental like voxels sort of
Yes.
reality. Okay.
Yeah, so the smallest unit on my screen is like a pixel. So they're like that, but if that pixel was actually also engaged in a metaphysical sense
Right.
so they have both the software and the hardware. They're both of those two things, and it operates and connects those two domains in order such that reality is not like a computer system where you have the display and programming separately, but reality is both displaying and programming itself constantly all of the time.
Right. And that operates via the SCSPL or is an extension of the SCSPL? Or
And
maybe I phrased that weird. Is that what is that like? What would those syntactic operators relation to the SCSPL be? I have it written down. Well, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so the syntactic operators are the lowest order of the SCSPL. So there's three orders. This is talked about in the metaformal system paper, is that it basically says that M, which is the metalinguistic identity of reality, which is the SCSPL, is an intrinsic equals rint equals intrinsic language equals I believe it's mu. It's one of the Greek letters, equals mu, which has within it a subsyntax of NT. And that means both the non-terminal and terminal domain, but N stands for tellers and N represents, it doesn't stand for, but it represents tellers, and T stands for syntactors. And so there are basically 5 strata of this, and then those comprise a grammar, which is called the mu morphism, and then that grammar then operates on reality to create the surface structure of reality, which has a different notation. But so basically, if you're trying to think about what goes into creating a universe that of the kind that we can see, they are syntactic operators, tertiary syntactors are basically like the 5th most important thing. It's the most important thing is the primary teller / syntactor, which are 2 aspects of the same thing, and then secondary tellers / syntactors, which are like human beings, which are very complex structurally agents in reality, and then but then sort of the glue that holds everything together and harmonizes all of those separate wills and is basically the canvas on which all of that can be projected is tertiary syntactors, which are kind of the fundamental most unit of reality.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and then this connects, or are there any more questions about that?
I did have one more question, but it's slightly different. It does sort of relate to what you're saying. I've just noticed through looking a lot through comparing self relations and comparing them to corresponding oxymorons, which make up the CTMU, I've noticed that sometimes people tend to use self relations interchangeably for different oxymorons. For example, self-inclusive. What is it? What is self-inclusion? That's topological and descriptive, I think. And then self-containing, which is set element, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard people lots of times basically use them interchangeably, basically talking about set element, talking about self-containment, talking about self-inclusion, and vice versa. And what do you think about, would you say that each oxymoron does have its own unique self-relation which is inseparable from it and not interchangeable with other oxymorons?
Yeah, exactly. So those are all oxymorons in ways that you wouldn't really usually think about because, like, for example, topological descriptive inclusion, that just sounds like a logical term, but it actually goes entirely against the grain of everything in set theory because what it's basically saying is that you can contain something which then contains you. And that doesn't make sense to our kind of rational mind, but then reality arises from the resolution of that paradox. And so there's a sense in which all of these paradoxes and how these things somehow fit together, they're all different questions, but then the answer is always the real universe. It's that. And so this is why both Christopher Langan and Bertrand Russell, who's one of the most famous logicians, described reality as a self-resolving paradox. It's that it contains the solution to all the question, obviously all these things are real questions, but the answer is always reality. So it's like everything, and because we said that the reality is syntactically isomorphic to the CTMU, it's like the CTMU contains the answers to all these things. And so that's why the CTMU is structured based on these paradoxes. This is how Chris Langan said he came up with the CTMU, is that he thought about all these paradoxes, and then the resolution has to come from this unified model that is actually descriptive of reality.
Okay. One last thing. That was a good explanation. I like that. One last thing. So I also noticed Langan talks about reality as self-generating, right? And he also talks about it as self-selecting. And he also uses the oxymoron generation and selection as synonymous with filtration and construction, or constructive filtration of duality. So I mean, my problem is that when you're thinking about it from a top-down perspective, then causation is selective. But if you're thinking about it from a bottom-up perspective, then causation is generative. Is generative. But the problem is, when you're talking about the self-relation value, you either have to use generative or selective. So, do you understand the problem I'm getting at?
Well, but causation is both of those things, and generation and selection are two aspects of the same process, is what I think that's trying to say. And
Yeah.
that's
I just
in
think it's confusing. I just think it's confusing when Langan says stuff like reality is self-generating, and then he says stuff like reality is self-selecting, as if that's all it is. But it's more like reality is self-generating in one way and self-selecting in the other, because it's a dual feedback of self-relation. If you exclude one or the other, then you're sort of left confused.
Yeah, so basically, reality is self-generating in the non-terminal domain, and then it's self-selecting in the terminal domain. And so these are things that are technically separate conceptually, but they're quite related in how they actually work, is that those two are constantly interfacing with one another. One is generating all of these designs and potentials, and one is selecting. There's an operator between those two that selects which things will actually become, embodied in space-time in the terminal domain.
Okay. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, as far as I can tell, the only problems I can really figure out about the CTMU is the limitation of language. And that's it. It's just that language isn't perfect for describing this thing. you know, as much as we try to make it perfect, there's always something that's limiting us.
Yeah, I think there's always some imprecision just because, terms can have several meanings in English that aren't, super precisely or clearly defined. We have dictionaries, but it's not talking about, you're kind of always trying to walk this line between coming up with all these new terms and trying to appropriate other ones. It's like what we're talking about with proto-computation is not really computation, and it's not really information either, but we're kind of trying to get to the closest thing to that. So yeah, so there's always going to be a little bit of imprecision in the way that we talk about these things. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I just thought of one more question. Am I allowed to ask one more question?
Yeah.
So, when I first came to the CTMU, when I first started reading about it, a big problem I had with it was that it kept referring to that it kept saying that all the objects were information and the universe itself was cognition. Now, the problem I had with that initially was that, well, I actually have I am capable of cognition, so how am I information capable of cognition? You know? But you said something interesting quite a few times when you said that as information we actually interact with our internal syntax, and that essentially is our cognition. That's our limited capacity for cognition, is our very limited interaction with that syntax, right?
Yeah.
But I'm still a little bit held up on the fact that our brains, which are beyond a doubt computational localities, which even in the physical object, it seems to have computational power. That computation isn't happening in the whole universe. That's happening in my head. Or, maybe it is happening in the whole universe and it's happening in my head at the same time. It's just hard for people who, it's just hard to sort of get your head around that, thinking that I'm information and I'm interacting with cognition, but I am actually cognitive as
Yes.
as an object.
Yeah, so basically that's kind of an expression of syndifionis, is that there is a very real sense in which you are separate from everything else in the universe, and that is happening to you. But then the global identity then extends over every single thing. And that syntax, as it says here, is like everything is internally simulating each other, is that we, my two different people, if they're interacting, one of them is that they are both existing within a common reality. And so if you have a shared reality, then you have those two aspects. There's one aspect, right, in which it's happening to you, and then a broader aspect in which that's happening to reality as well. And so you're implicated by virtue of your separateness in the the sameness medium of reality.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So this, and I'm gonna try to wrap up soon because we've been going for more than an hour. But so this connects kind of to then the more advanced some of the more advanced principles, which I'll just kind of gloss over here because we're gonna go over these way more in depth later in the course. It says, so then under the guidance of a limiting intrinsic form of the anthropic principle, which if you don't know is this idea in physics that the universe is specifically calibrated or adjusted for the existence of biological life, or in particular human life in some cases, called the Telic principle. So all anthropic principles are teleological because they're saying that the universe has an intrinsic end. And there's a weak anthropic principle which says that, we live in this vast multiverse and we just happen to be in the one in which there are participants. I don't find that particularly convincing. And then there's the strong anthropic principle, which says that, maybe we don't know exactly how this works, but there's just too many coincidences that in terms of the physical constants of the universe, that had to align for human life to exist. So basically what we're going to say is that life was actually part of the universe's intention. And that's what the CTMU does. It does that through the Telic principle, which says that there's this Telic recursion, there is this self-programming of the universe through the interaction between the non-terminal and terminal domain, which is which is striving towards self-identification, and it does this through the creation of identification operators. So everything in the universe is part of this cycle of the universe seeing itself, and that's what Telic recursion is doing. It takes a general utility. It says that generally what is valuable to the universe is consciousness, it's life, it's all these different things, and then it uses that as not determining anything, but as kind of a parameter for its creative evolution. So it says here, adjusting the fly to freely changing internal conditions. So again, just asking questions here. It's not giving the answer, but it's saying, it would be really great if we had life, if we had different ways that the universe could recognize itself, if we could have star systems and galaxies and so forth. And so this is possible because Telic recursion is the way that SCSPL evolves in the physical universe, relating space-time and object by means of conspansion, which is a more general kind of Telic recursion, and is embodied in the conspansive manifold, which is a mathematical structure that reflects reality's existence and evolution. And the evolution of the manifold is the same as the evolution of the universe. So that is a process that occurs within that language that both designs the universe in the non-terminal domain in this world of design and potential in the spirit world. So it designs it in the spirit world, and then it actualizes it. It actually creates it in our world, in the terminal domain, which is similar, as is talked about in some later papers, to some of the ideas of quantum mechanics. So then because the design and actualization phases are basically two aspects of the same process, conspansive space-time also is basically the same as intelligent design. It says that we have a universe, and the universe is trying to create something using application of intelligence. And the CTMU actually defines intelligence as the ability to recognize and process the universe. So this means that yes, there's natural selection, but that's a trivial observation. It's not important. What is actually important is the intelligent design of nature that goes into that selection. So he's just saying, why is there life? Well, natural selection. Well, that's already answering the question before you've said, what is nature selecting for? How does that selection work? And that goes back into that duality between generation and selection of which we just spoke. And so that over time will create more information and complexity as the universe identifies itself and relates our ideas of natural selection not only to life, as in Darwinism, but also to the cosmos, to the universe's evolution. And therefore, it addresses a lot of the problems that we've had in physics, biology, and so forth, while here preserving all of the benefits of existing scientific and mathematical paradigms. Because remember, we're not throwing out all science, we're actually extending it and grounding it in a deeper truth. So that's essentially what the CTMU is about. I want to hopefully wrap up soon, but if there are any urgent questions, I'll take those now.
Thank you for that talk, Tommy. I guess you were talking about it loads earlier, but I still am struggling with primary, secondary, and tertiary concept. As far as I'm aware, primary is God, everything, the whole. Secondary is the element, the object in the set, and tertiary. I understand it as that's the self-relation value, or that's like the syntactic medium which self-distributes between both tellers, both primary and secondary. Am I right there?
Yeah, so that's basically what that, they're not exactly quantum particles, but they're basically the fundamental units of reality. So we talked about the conspansive manifold, that is which basically its evolution is the same as the universe. So what the universe actually exists of in conspansive spacetime is these small discrete units of reality that are not that are subject to broader.
Would you say that they're analogous to photons? Because scientifically they're the smallest things there are, and you know they're not just small, that they're actually zero dimensional and expand to the size of the universe.
Yeah.
That it wouldn't even be fair to call them small. They're literally just a point.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is what Christopher Langan and a peer of mine, mathematical metaphysics, has talked about, is that a syntactic operator is basically a coupling of two things. It's a photon, which is a quanta of light. It's the smallest divisible unit of light, which can exist either as a particle or as a wave. And what light represents is basically that which can capture and encode information and then can be represented to something else later. So light and this is true, interestingly, if you watch Christopher Langan's video on CTMU radio called what is light or something, and it's about Genesis 1:3, where God says, let there be light, and there was light, and that's a primordial element of creation. And so basically the idea with both religiously and in physics is that light is a quantum of telesis. It's a quantum of the basic unit of reality. And so a syntactic operator is
made up of light.
Is made up of light, where again we're sort of playing with definitions because we're extending the light concept to then include all of these teleological aspects which are not in use in standard physics. If you ask physicists what light is, basically what they'd say is that it's pure information. But what the CTMU says is that it's information as applied to protocomputation, which means it's a unit of SCSPL. But a syntactic operator, so it's both a photon, it's both a discrete unit of light, it's an elementary particle and a force carrier, but it's also a fermion, which is something that actually
that's just more subatomic. It's just getting deeper into subatomic physics, isn't it?
Yeah, and so this is something that we could go into very, very deeply, but basically what that means is that it's both terminal and non-terminal. It's both a fermion and a photon.
I do personally have a small problem with using, because the CTMU, the whole point is when you're talking about information, that word information distributes universally to all objects that exist. But as soon as you start talking about light, you could say that everything is made up of light, but at higher levels of, light may be the very fundamental being of everything, but there are higher levels of comprehensiveness that, where it's not really light anymore, it's more like matter. And then or it is light, but it acts like matter, and it acts psychological or spiritual, whatever. And as soon as you start to define the information as light, I just feel like you're stepping outside of the bounds of the CTMU, because you're stepping outside of that generality between maximal and minimal. You're actually defining it, and then you're kind of stepping out of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's why that's not the parlance that's used. The parlance that's used is telesis, which is a generalization of light and information that incorporates the reflexive self-processing that we talked about.
Right. Okay. I guess if light is the fundament, it's like saying reality is the fundamental medium. By the same notion, you could say that light is the fundamental medium at the minimal level, while reality is the fundamental medium at the maximal level. Could you say that? Would that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, light, we can just talk about telesis is that telesis spans both the minimal and maximal strata of reality. So it's both of those things are basically, if you want to talk about it like that, is that like the universe is the self-stratification of light, is that there is this kind of pure essence which is encoded within that information contained within that light, and then it is continually, and then every process property and relation within reality is how that light is interacting with itself.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, that does make sense. It's like a stratification of reality and complexification of light.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, I like to pick apart the CTMU and sometimes I even like to add oxymorons, which things like software and hardware, it's like, you said that's an oxymoron, software and hardware. It may not be the fact that the universe is a computer, it might be it's proto-computational, but isn't that valid as well to say that?
Yeah.
It's analogous. It's analogous. The CTMU is an interpretive system. It's analogous to what you're trying to figure. It's like you're using limited language to try and grasp this thing.
Yeah, I agree, but that's, I guess, kind of the challenge about, reality theory is that you have to try to describe these very complex and specific processes using, hopefully simple enough language that others can.
I guess you have to be very selective, to pardon the pun, but you have to be very selective with which words are the most meaningful and which are the most logical and actually comprehensive to use.
Yeah.
And then you can just dispose of the ones which are a little bit more abstract. I think I've had all my questions answered. Thank you very much, Tommy.
Amazing. Thank you to everyone who came here, took time out of their afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. Greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. See you later.